Musk is obviously not eligible for the role because he was born in South Africa. And they joke that Elon Musk could become president anyway. The Constitution is, it's just a big joke. They say that Trump should declare himself the personal embodiment of the living Constitution. So what is it that Curtis Yarvin and Michael Anton are proposing here? Is it something just like the New Deal but from the right? Well, they have something far more radical in mind. So, but particularly Curtis Yarvin, and Anton doesn't provide much opposition to this, he wants a dictator from day one. So he wants Trump to announce a national emergency in an inaugural address and encourage every state government to do the same, and then federalize the National Guard around the country and welcome backup from sympathetic members of the police. And when federal agencies refuse to go along, Curtis Yarvin suggests that Trump use a Trump app to communicate directly with his 80 million supporters on their smartphones, using notifications to tell them this agency isn't following my instructions, so the supporters will then rally at the proper building with the crowd steered around by a joystick by Trump himself, forming a human barricade around every federal building supporting Trump's authority. So whereas maybe 20,000 people stormed the Capitol on January 6th, Curtis Yarvin has in mind millions responding to the Trump app, a modern-day version of the paramilitary groups that ensured Lincoln's safety during the Civil War, during the 1860 campaign for president. And so how should Trump as a dictator then respond to Harvard and the New York Times? And Yarvin says it's essential to smash these oppositional institutions with one blow. So Trump should not have to deal with someone else's reality. So the podcast concludes that Trump dropped the leadership of the deplorables, which is waiting to be picked up by someone who will make Trump seem moderate. And then Curtis Yarvin responds with a quote from the Serbian dictator, Slobodan Milosevic: "The goal should be no one will dare to beat you anymore." Now, defenders of Michael Anton, Curtis Yarvin, the Claremont Institute will say that this fantasy discussion about Trump dictatorship, it's just fantasies disconnected from reality. Yet fantasies are outgrowths of our hopes and imaginations. They help to set our expectations. And now the leading conservative institute in the United States that supports Donald Trump hosts a podcast by someone who served as a senior official in 2 presidential administrations, Michael Anton, and he hosts an invited guest, Curtis Yarvin, delivering arguments about why a future president should become a tyrant and a dictator and how he could go about accomplishing that task. So there's going to be blowback for this type of thinking. You don't think that the left would be ready to engage with at least equal amounts of violence? So once you suggest that, hey, we should move outside of the legal system and start enforcing our will by violence, well, the left will respond to that with at least equal amounts of violence. Luke, you called the Constitution a joke before, if I remember correctly. I call it the Constitution a joke if you worship it, right? So within certain times, certain contexts, the Constitution provides a valuable basis for a government. But the Constitution is not an end in and of itself. So I don't believe in worshiping the Constitution. I respect the Constitution as a document that helped shape the history of the United States, but it should not be worshipped in and of itself. So if the Constitution can simply be superseded by all the civil rights legislation that we've had since the 1960s, if the United States Supreme Court can supersede it, then that places our understanding of the Constitution in its proper place. It's a document that had a substantial effect on the founding of the United States, but now we've got Supreme Courts and political legislation that frequently supersedes the Constitution. So it has limited value. Also, there's a difference between what is true and what is advisable to say. So yeah, the Constitution is flawed, and however wonderful the Constitution is, it can be superseded by events. So we should not depend upon a Constitution to save us. It's much better to have power. Right? Rely on power to save you. But if you're going to speak out loud about your side committing mass violence to take power, then there are consequences for that. And the consequences are that your opposition will be inspired to act violently to oppose you, and they will feel morally off the hook to do absolutely anything that they can to oppose you. So you are dramatically upping the stakes. No, I don't think he's a glowy. I just think he's someone who likes to think out loud, and sometimes he says things that are interesting, but much of the time I think it's kind of useless. So I grew up with a father who was always talking about how then shall we live, and so I think that's affected me. Here I'm doing countless shows, how then should we live, but it's an unusual upbringing. I mean, my father published books on how to overcome anxiety, yet my father was among the most anxious people I ever knew. My father published books on how to overcome fear. My father was among the most fearful people I knew. My father published books on how to be happy, and my father was among the most unhappy people I ever knew. And none of this is to discredit my father. I think he was able to develop such a substantial following because he had at least some understanding of his own vulnerability and his own struggles in these areas. And so he was very much coming from the place of the wounded healer, someone who struggled with fear, anxiety, and unhappiness, and tried to create a good life. And he used religion for it. So traditionally, the answer to how should we then live was to get cues from your religious community. Like traditionally, we lived in a small area where our grandparents had lived, our parents lived, and where we know people, all our lives. That's the traditional way of life. And religion in that context, where we're living in the same area generation after generation after generation, religion would affect how people behaved. And because you were so well known, people were able to kind of keep tabs on you, and there was not the modern amount of anonymity. So traditional answer, how should we then live, was religion. But over the past 150 years, religion has assumed less and less power in people's lives. So then we've had the rise of secular gurus and secular religion, among them, say, Freudian analysis. And so psychoanalysis reached its heights of influence in the United States probably in the 1950s and 1960s. And so for many secular people, they would go to their psychoanalyst to learn how to live. Around the same time, we had the tremendous explosion of 12-step programs, starting with Alcoholics Anonymous, then going to Al-Anon, Debtors Anonymous, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. And many people found a way to live from that. So I grew up the son of a man who was always teaching people how to live.